He thought he was removing just another poorly dressed passenger from the executive lounge, but within the next 15 minutes, the entire terminal would realize he had humiliated one of the most powerful women in American aviation. The polished marble floors of Westbridge International Airport reflected the warm glow of the late afternoon sun, as travelers rushed through Terminal 3 dragging luxury luggage behind them. Flight announcements echoed softly overhead, while businessmen in tailored suits hurried toward private lounges, barely looking at the people around them. Near Gate A12, a tense silence was already beginning to spread. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one last time to leave the lounge area immediately," Ethan Caldwell said sharply, his voice carrying farther than necessary across the crowded terminal. Several passengers turned their heads. A few slowed their pace. Ethan stood tall in his dark Navy airport operations uniform, his security badge gleaming beneath the bright overhead lights. At 42, he had spent years managing VIP traveler relations at one of the busiest airports in the country, and he prided himself on maintaining what he called standards. In front of him stood Claire Whitaker, calm and motionless beside the entrance to the executive lounge. She wore a simple gray sweater, dark jeans, and white sneakers that looked comfortably worn. A faded canvas travel bag rested near her feet. Nothing about her appearance suggested private wealth, influence, or corporate status. And that was exactly why Ethan had already decided she didn't belong there. "I already explained," Claire replied quietly, her voice steady despite the growing crowd watching the exchange. "I'm waiting for someone." Ethan gave a cold smile. "This lounge is reserved for premium travelers and executive members only. You can wait in the general seating area with everyone else." The words landed harder than he intended, and a few nearby passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Claire remained composed, though her fingers tightened slightly around the strap of her bag. Not anger, not embarrassment, just restraint. Across the terminal, a little girl standing beside her. Mother tugged gently on her sleeve. "Mom," she whispered softly. "Why are they treating her like that?" Her mother quickly looked away, pretending not to hear. Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice only slightly. "Look, ma'am, people are starting to stare. Let's not make this difficult." What Ethan Caldwell didn't know was that Claire Whitaker had spent the last decade building one of the most influential aviation technology companies in the United States. Her software systems quietly powered logistics, security coordination, and passenger traffic management in more than 30 airports across North America. Industry executives knew her name instantly. Financial magazines called her one of the most powerful women in transportation innovation. But Claire had never cared much about appearances. She preferred quiet hotels, simple clothes, and commercial flights over publicity and attention. In fact, she had deliberately avoided announcing her visit to Westbridge International. She wanted to observe the airport anonymously before signing a multi-billion-dollar modernization partnership that could transform the future of the entire airport system. Unfortunately for Ethan Caldwell, arrogance often blinds people long before consequences arrive. "Sir," a younger airport employee whispered nervously as he approached Ethan from behind. "Maybe we should double-check her credentials first." Ethan barely glanced at him. "I already did," he replied confidently. "No executive access. No verified membership. This area is not for random walk-ins." The phrase random walk-ins caused another wave of whispers to spread through the terminal. Claire noticed several passengers quietly lifting their phones now. Recording, watching, waiting, but she still didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at Ethan with calm blue eyes that somehow unsettled him more than an argument would have. "Are you refusing to let me stay here?" she asked softly. Ethan folded his arms. "I'm asking you to leave before security escorts you out." A hush fell over the terminal. For a brief moment, even the rolling suitcases and distant announcements seemed quieter. Then Claire slowly reached into the pocket of her sweater and pulled out her phone. Ethan smirked slightly, assuming she was finally calling someone to pick her up. Instead, Claire calmly typed a short message, paused, and pressed send. Then she looked back at him and said something that would soon change the atmosphere of the entire airport. "All right," she said gently. "Let's see how your airport handles this." For several long seconds, nothing happened. Ethan Caldwell stood confidently near the executive lounge entrance with his arms folded across his chest, while the growing crowd waited to see how the quiet woman in the gray sweater would react. Most people expected anger. Others expected embarrassment. But Claire Whitaker simply slipped her phone back into her pocket and remained completely calm. And somehow that calmness unsettled the room more than shouting ever could. The terminal lights reflected softly against the massive glass windows overlooking the runway, where private jets and commercial aircraft lined the evening horizon beneath streaks of orange sunlight. Travelers slowed their pace as they passed Gate A12. A businessman pretending to check emails stopped walking entirely. 2 college students whispered while pretending to organize their backpacks. Even the airport cafe across the hall had grown quieter as employees glanced toward the unfolding confrontation. Ethan noticed the attention and straightened his posture slightly. Public authority mattered to him. Control mattered even more. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "I need a clear answer. Are you leaving voluntarily or not?" Claire tilted her head slightly as if genuinely considering the question. "I have an important meeting here," she replied, "and I do not believe I have done anything wrong." Ethan gave a short, humorless laugh. People with important meetings usually arrive dressed for them. A few uncomfortable chuckles came from nearby travelers. Claire lowered her eyes briefly, not out of shame but restraint. She had heard variations of the same judgment her entire career. Investors who assumed she was an assistant. Executives who mistook her for hotel staff. Conference hosts who ignored her until her name appeared on stage screens behind them. Success had taught Claire something dangerous about human nature. The less powerful people believed you were, the more honest they became about themselves. A younger airport employee named Marcus shifted nervously beside Ethan. At 26, Marcus had only worked at Westbridge International for 8 months. But even he sensed something about the situation felt wrong. Claire did not behave like someone confused or desperate. There was no panic in her eyes. No pleading. No defensiveness. Just patience. "Sir," Marcus whispered carefully, "maybe we should contact executive services before escalating this." Ethan turned sharply toward him. "Executive services handles actual VIP passengers," he replied loud enough for others to hear. "Not random people trying to wander into restricted areas." The words landed harder this time. Claire noticed a middle-aged woman near the coffee stand quietly shaking her head in disapproval. Nearby, the little girl from earlier still stared openly at Claire while holding her mother's hand. "Mom," she whispered again. "She does not seem dangerous." Her mother gently hushed her, but several nearby passengers exchanged glances. The atmosphere had begun to shift. Not fully against Ethan yet, but the certainty in the terminal was weakening. Then Ethan made the mistake that would later replay in his mind for weeks. He reached toward Claire's canvas bag with visible irritation. "Fine," he snapped. "If you are refusing to cooperate, security can escort you and your belongings out of the terminal lounge area." Marcus immediately looked alarmed. "Sir, maybe we should not touch her property." Ethan ignored him completely. Claire slowly lifted one hand, stopping Ethan before he could grab the bag. Her voice remained soft, almost gentle. "I would not do that if I were you." The calmness in her tone caused Ethan to hesitate for half a second, but pride quickly overpowered caution. "And why exactly not?" he challenged. Claire looked directly into his eyes for the first time since the confrontation began. Her expression did not carry anger. That was what made it unsettling. "Because in about 5 minutes," she said quietly, "a lot of people in this airport are going to wish this conversation had gone differently." A silence spread through the terminal so suddenly that even the nearby rolling luggage seemed louder than before. Ethan opened his mouth to respond when the sharp sound of approaching footsteps echoed across the polished floor behind him. Fast, urgent, coordinated. Marcus turned first. His face immediately lost color. 3 senior airport executives in dark suits were hurrying through the terminal directly toward Gate A12, and behind them walked a silver-haired man Ethan recognized instantly. Richard Holloway, chairman of the Westbridge International Airport Authority. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. Men at Holloway's level did not run through terminals unless something had gone terribly wrong. The moment Richard Holloway appeared in Terminal 3, the atmosphere changed completely. Conversations faded mid-sentence. Rolling suitcases slowed. Even the nearby airport employees straightened instinctively as the chairman of the Westbridge International Airport Authority moved quickly across the polished marble floor surrounded by senior executives in tailored charcoal suits. Ethan Caldwell felt the confidence draining from his body one heartbeat at a time. Richard Holloway was not simply another executive. He was one of the most influential men in commercial aviation on the East Coast, a man whose decisions affected billions of dollars in airport contracts, infrastructure, and corporate partnerships. Ethan had only spoken to him directly twice in 6 years, and both times had been during formal staff reviews. Yet now Holloway was walking directly toward Claire Whitaker with visible urgency in his expression. Ethan swallowed hard. Beside him, Marcus looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor entirely. Claire, however, remained perfectly calm beside her faded canvas bag, as though none of this surprised her at all. Holloway reached them quickly, slightly out of breath from the pace. Then, to Ethan's horror, the airport chairman extended both hands toward Claire with immediate warmth and respect. "Ms. Whitaker," he said sincerely, "I am deeply sorry for this situation." The terminal fell, completely silent. Ethan blinked once, certain he had misunderstood what he just heard. "Ms. Whitaker. Not ma'am. Not passenger. Not traveler." The chairman knew her personally. Claire gave a small polite smile. "Good evening, Richard." Even her tone carried familiarity. Holloway glanced briefly toward Ethan and the surrounding employees before lowering his voice slightly. "I received your message the second it came through. I came as quickly as I could." Several nearby passengers exchanged stunned looks. One businessman slowly lowered the phone he had been secretly recording with. Claire folded her hands calmly in front of her. "I was simply trying to wait for our scheduled meeting," she said softly. "Unfortunately, your staff seemed to believe I did not belong here." Holloway's expression tightened immediately. Behind him, the senior executive team looked visibly uncomfortable now, shifting their posture as the realization spread through the group. Ethan's mouth suddenly felt dry. "Sir," he interrupted nervously, "there appears to have been some misunderstanding here." Holloway turned slowly toward him. The disappointment in his eyes was far worse than anger. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated quietly. Ethan forced a stiff smile. "We were following standard executive lounge procedures. She did not present verified credentials, and so you decided to humiliate her publicly." Holloway's voice remained controlled, but the sharpness beneath it cut through the terminal like cold steel. Ethan immediately stopped speaking. Claire noticed several airport staff members nearby lowering their eyes now, unwilling to watch the scene unfold any further. Across the terminal, the little girl from earlier whispered excitedly to her mother, "I told you she was important." But the truth was even larger than most people there realized. What almost nobody inside Terminal 3 understood yet was that Claire Whitaker was not simply another wealthy executive traveler. She was the founder and chief executive officer of Altera Systems, the aviation technology company currently negotiating the single largest modernization partnership in Westbridge International Airport history. Partnership valued at nearly $4.8 billion over the next decade. Her software already powered passenger logistics at 32 major airports across the country. Security systems, traffic coordination, emergency response optimization. Claire Whitaker's technology quietly shaped modern aviation every single day, even if most travelers had never heard her name. And tonight, she had intentionally arrived alone and dressed simply because she wanted to observe how ordinary passengers were treated before finalizing the partnership agreement. Ethan Caldwell had unknowingly become part of that evaluation. Holloway exhaled slowly before speaking again. "Ms. Whitaker has spent the last 8 months deciding whether this airport deserves her company's trust," he said carefully. "And tonight was supposed to be our final discussion before signing." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. Around them, whispers exploded quietly through the crowd. "For $0.8 billion. CO. partnership, evaluation. The words spread from passenger to passenger like electricity through the terminal air. Marcus looked physically sick now. Claire remained motionless through all of it, her calm somehow making the humiliation around Ethan feel even heavier. Then Holloway asked the question Ethan dreaded most. "Mr. Caldwell," he said quietly, "would you care to explain why one of the most respected executives in American aviation was nearly escorted out of my terminal tonight?" Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out. And in that crushing silence, the entire terminal began realizing just how badly he had misjudged the quiet woman standing in front of him. Ethan Caldwell had spent years believing he could identify important people within seconds. Expensive watches, designer luggage, tailored suits, private security. Those were the signs he trusted. Those were the signals he built his confidence around. And now, standing beneath the bright terminal lights with dozens of travelers staring at him in silence, he realized how catastrophically wrong that belief had become. His throat tightened as Richard Holloway continued looking at him with visible disappointment. "Sir," Ethan began carefully, trying to steady his voice, "I was only enforcing airport policy." Holloway's expression hardened immediately. "Airport policy?" he repeated. "Show me the policy that allows an employee to publicly humiliate a guest based on appearance." Ethan opened his mouth again, but nothing came out, because deep down, he knew exactly when professionalism had crossed into arrogance. The moment he mocked her clothes, the moment he called her a random walk-in, the moment he decided someone could not belong simply because they looked ordinary. Claire Whitaker watched the exchange quietly without interrupting. Around her, the atmosphere inside Terminal 3 had transformed completely. Just minutes earlier, passengers had viewed her as another traveler being removed from a restricted area. Now people were staring with a mixture of shock, curiosity, and embarrassment for having silently watched the humiliation unfold. Several airport employees standing near the cafe lowered their heads awkwardly. One woman at the information desk quietly whispered to her coworker, "That is Claire Whitaker? From Alt Aris." Her coworker nodded slowly, eyes wide. "My husband works in aviation logistics. He talks about her company constantly." Ethan heard the whispers spreading behind him like waves. Altaris Systems, for $0.8 billion. Chief Executive Officer. Aviation Technology Leader. Every phrase felt heavier than the last. Marcus remained frozen beside the lounge entrance, his face pale with second-hand dread. He remembered warning Ethan twice to slow down. But Ethan had been too focused on asserting control to notice caution. Holloway turned toward Claire again, visibly regretful now. "Ms. Whitaker, I cannot apologize enough for this experience." Claire gave a small polite nod. "I appreciate that, Richard." Her voice remained calm, almost surprisingly gentle considering what had happened. That calmness only deepened the discomfort spreading through the terminal, because she was not demanding revenge. She was not yelling. She was not threatening lawsuits or firing employees on the spot. Instead, she stood with quiet dignity while everyone around her slowly confronted their own assumptions. Holloway glanced toward the senior executive team behind him. "Prepare the conference lounge immediately," he instructed, "and contact hospitality services personally. I want this handled correctly." The executives nodded quickly and hurried away without hesitation. Ethan watched them go, realizing nobody was looking at him anymore. Not as authority, not as leadership, only as the man who had nearly sabotaged the largest partnership in airport history because he judged someone by a sweater and a canvas bag. Then Claire finally looked directly at him again. Her blue eyes were calm, steady, impossible to read completely. "Mr. Caldwell," she said softly, "may I ask you something?" Ethan swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am." If I had arrived wearing a $6,000 suit and carrying designer luggage, would this conversation have happened? The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Ethan's face flushed immediately because every person standing there already knew the answer. Holloway closed his eyes briefly. Disappointment etched across his expression. Marcus stared down at the marble floor. Even nearby passengers looked uncomfortable now, as if they had personally witnessed something deeply unfair. Ethan tried to answer anyway. I was only trying to maintain standards. Claire tilted her head slightly. Standards, she repeated quietly. Or assumptions? Another hush fell across the terminal. Claire stepped closer to the lounge entrance, her worn white sneakers barely making sound against the polished floor. You know, she continued calmly, when I built my company, I spent years walking into rooms where people assumed I did not belong. Investors ignored me. Executives spoke to the men beside me instead of me. Hotel staff handed me housekeeping schedules instead of conference credentials. Ethan stared at her silently. At some point, Claire said, I realized something important. The people who judge appearances the fastest usually understand character the least. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. The entire terminal heard them anyway. Holloway slowly exhaled. Beside her, while several nearby travelers exchanged quiet looks of reflection. Then Claire glanced toward the large runway windows where aircraft lights blinked against the darkening evening sky. Tonight was supposed to help me decide whether Westbridge International was ready for the future, she said softly. Because technology matters. Efficiency matters. But none of it matters if the people representing your airport treat dignity like a luxury item. Ethan felt those words settle over the terminal with crushing weight. And for the first time that evening, he truly understood that the worst part of humiliation was not being corrected publicly. It was realizing too late that the person you underestimated had seen your character clearly from the very beginning. The silence inside Terminal 3 lingered long after Claire Whitaker finished speaking. It was no longer the silence of curiosity. It had become the silence of realization. Travelers who had once watched the confrontation for entertainment now looked uncomfortable standing there. Some glanced away entirely. Others stared at Ethan Caldwell with expressions that quietly asked the same question. How could someone in charge of hospitality fail so completely at basic human respect? The overhead airport announcements resumed in the background, but even they seemed distant now beneath the tension spreading through the terminal. Outside the massive glass walls, runway lights flickered against the dark evening sky while aircraft taxied slowly through the rain-speckled tarmac. Claire remained composed beside her canvas bag, but Richard Holloway could already see the damage this incident had caused. Not simply public embarrassment, trust damage, the kind that changed billion-dollar decisions. Holloway cleared his throat carefully. Ms. Whitaker, he said respectfully, if you would allow us the opportunity, I would still very much like to continue tonight's meeting privately. Claire studied him for a moment before answering. I came here tonight hoping to see whether this airport truly valued people, she replied softly. Not just investors, not just executives, everyone. Holloway nodded slowly, visibly, absorbing every word. And I understand that we failed that test tonight. Ethan lowered his eyes immediately. Hearing the chairman admit failure publicly felt like a blow heavier than any formal punishment. Marcus stood quietly nearby, wishing he had spoken up sooner and louder. Claire glanced toward the rows of travelers still watching from nearby gates. You know what concerns me most? She asked calmly. This happened because nobody questioned it at first. Several passengers shifted awkwardly as though those words had reached directly into the crowd. Claire continued gently, not with anger but disappointment. One person makes a judgment, and suddenly everyone else assumes the judgment must be correct. That is how dignity disappears in public spaces. Ethan finally forced himself to speak again. Ms. Whitaker, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. Claire looked at him calmly but said nothing yet. Ethan swallowed hard before continuing. I made assumptions about you based on appearance, and I handled this situation poorly. Holloway watched carefully beside him. So did the executives. So did the travelers standing frozen throughout the terminal. Ethan's voice weakened slightly beneath the weight of so many eyes. I thought I was protecting standards, he admitted. But I understand now that I was protecting my own bias instead. Another hush settled over the terminal. The honesty in the statement surprised even Marcus. For the first time all evening, Ethan no longer sounded defensive. He sounded ashamed. Claire studied him quietly for several long seconds. Then she asked a question nobody expected. "How long have you worked here, Mr. Caldwell?" Ethan blinked slightly. "Almost 6 years. And before that?" "Hotel management," he answered carefully. Claire nodded once. "Then you understand something many people do not. Hospitality is not really about luxury." Ethan looked at her uncertainly. "It is about making people feel respected," Claire said softly. "Especially when nobody important seems to be watching." Those words landed heavily across the terminal. Nearby, the little girl from earlier smiled faintly at Claire while her mother looked visibly emotional now. Even several airport employees standing behind the information desk seemed affected by the conversation unfolding in front of them. Holloway exhaled slowly. "Ms. Whitaker," he said carefully, "I know tonight cannot be undone, but I hope this airport still has an opportunity to earn your partnership." Claire turned toward the runway windows again, watching the blinking aircraft lights in silence. For a moment, nobody dared interrupt her thoughts, because everyone there understood that the future of Westbridge International might now depend entirely on what she said next. Finally, Claire looked back toward Holloway. "Technology can improve airports," she said calmly. "Efficiency can improve airports. But culture decides whether people actually feel welcome inside them." Holloway nodded immediately. "You are right." Claire glanced once more at Ethan. "I do not believe people should be destroyed over one mistake," she said quietly. Ethan looked up in surprise. "But I do believe moments like this reveal what organizations truly tolerate." Holloway's expression tightened again because he understood exactly what she meant. A culture is never defined by mission statements hanging on walls. It is defined by what employees feel comfortable doing in front of everyone else. Claire lifted her canvas bag gently from the floor. "So the question now," she said softly, "is whether tonight becomes an embarrassment your airport hides from, or a lesson your airport grows from." No one spoke after that, because deep down, everyone in Terminal 3 knew she was no longer talking only about airports anymore. For nearly 10 seconds after Claire Whitaker finished speaking, nobody inside Terminal 3 moved at all. The polished airport corridor that normally pulsed with noise and urgency now felt suspended in place beneath the soft glow of overhead lights. Travelers stood frozen beside rolling luggage. Employees remained still behind their stations. Even the distant announcements echoing through the terminal seemed quieter somehow, as though the entire airport itself understood the weight of what had just been said. Richard Holloway slowly adjusted his suit jacket, clearly searching for the right words. In all his years managing one of the busiest airports in the country, he had negotiated billion-dollar contracts, handled corporate crises, and faced federal investigations. Yet somehow this moment felt more uncomfortable than all of them, because Claire Whitaker had exposed something impossible to hide behind public relations language. Character. Holloway finally looked toward Ethan Caldwell again. "Mr. Caldwell," he said carefully, "I think it would be wise if you stepped away from operations for the evening." Ethan's face tightened immediately. The sentence was calm, professional, but everyone understood what it meant. Ethan lowered his eyes slowly. "Yes, sir." For a moment, the once confident operations manager looked far older than 42. The authority he had worn so proudly earlier now seemed to have vanished entirely beneath the bright terminal lights. Yet before Ethan could turn away, Claire spoke again. "Richard," she said quietly. Holloway immediately looked back toward her. Claire glanced once at Ethan before continuing. "I do not believe humiliation should be answered with humiliation." Ethan looked up in surprise. So did several nearby employees. Claire remained composed, her voice soft but unwavering. "What happened tonight should absolutely be addressed," she continued. "But if people only learn fear from leadership, then eventually they stop learning empathy altogether." Holloway studied her silently. Claire stepped slightly closer, her canvas bag resting lightly against her shoulder. "The problem is bigger than one employee," she said, "because nobody stopped it." Those words spread heavily through the terminal. Marcus felt his stomach tighten immediately because he knew she was right. He had sensed the situation was wrong almost from the beginning, yet he had allowed Ethan's confidence and authority to silence his own instincts. Several nearby employees looked equally uncomfortable now, quietly confronting the same realization. Claire noticed the expressions around her. Most public humiliation survives because ordinary people convince themselves it is not their place to interrupt it, she said gently. That is how unhealthy cultures grow. Holloway slowly nodded. You are describing exactly what we have failed to notice. Claire gave a faint smile, though sadness touched it briefly. Success can make organizations dangerous in subtle ways, she replied. People become so focused on image, status, and appearance that they stop seeing human beings clearly. Across the terminal, the little girl who had spoken earlier still watched Claire carefully. This time, however, her mother quietly smiled at her daughter and squeezed her hand as though silently acknowledging the lesson unfolding in front of them both. Ethan finally forced himself to speak again. Ms. Whitaker, he said quietly, I understand if your company walks away after tonight. Claire looked at him calmly. Do you know why I came here dressed this way? Ethan shook his head slowly. Claire glanced down briefly at her simple sweater and worn sneakers. Because the future of transportation is not really about technology, she said softly. It is about trust. Airports are emotional places. People arrive exhausted, grieving, nervous, overwhelmed, hopeful. Some are saying goodbye forever. Some are flying toward emergencies. Some are trying to start over. The terminal remained silent around her. And in moments like that, Claire continued, the way employees treat ordinary people matters far more than luxury lounges or polished marble floors. Ethan lowered his head again, unable to argue with a single word. Holloway exhaled slowly beside them. You are absolutely right. Claire looked toward the runway windows where rain had begun sliding gently down the glass beyond the blinking aircraft lights. I built alt-era systems because I believe transportation could become more human, she said quietly. More efficient, yes, but also more compassionate. Then she turned back toward Holloway with calm, steady eyes. So here is my decision. The executives nearby visibly stiffened. Travelers leaned slightly closer. Even Ethan looked up again. Claire paused for one long moment before speaking. I am not canceling the partnership. A wave of stunned relief passed visibly through Holloway's face. Several executives quietly exhaled behind him, but Claire was not finished. However, she continued calmly, before we sign anything, I want every executive at this airport to complete frontline passenger service training themselves. Personally. No exceptions. Holloway blinked in surprise. Claire's voice remained gentle. Because people should never become so important that they forget how ordinary people deserve to be treated. The terminal fell silent once more. And this time, the silence carried something different. Not tension. Not embarrassment. Understanding. The tension inside Terminal 3 slowly began to soften after Claire Whitaker announced that she would continue the partnership discussions. But although relief spread across the faces of the airport executives, something deeper remained hanging in the air. Reflection. The kind that settles over people when they realize they have witnessed more than an embarrassing public mistake. They have witnessed a truth about themselves. Richard Holloway stood quietly for a moment beside Claire, watching rain slide down the giant runway windows while distant aircraft lights blinked against the dark evening sky. Around them, travelers slowly resumed movement through the terminal, but not with the same energy as before. People walked more quietly now. Employees spoke more carefully. It was as though the entire airport had unconsciously lowered its voice. Marcus finally stepped forward, nervous but determined. Ms. Whitaker, he said carefully, I just wanted to say, I should have spoken up sooner. Claire turned toward him with calm curiosity. Marcus shifted awkwardly beneath the attention. I knew the situation did not feel right, he admitted, but I kept telling myself it was not my place to challenge management publicly. Claire studied him for a moment before giving a faint, understanding smile. That instinct is more common than you think, she said gently. Most people are afraid of creating conflict. Marcus nodded slowly. I think I was more afraid of being wrong. Claire's expression softened slightly. Sometimes protecting another person's dignity matters more than protecting your own comfort. The words settled deeply into Marcus's chest. Nearby, Ethan Caldwell remained silent, listening carefully to every exchange. Earlier that evening, he would have dismissed conversations like this as sentimental distractions from operational efficiency. But standing there now beneath the cold terminal lighting, stripped of certainty and pride, he understood how dangerous that mindset had become. Holloway glanced toward Ethan thoughtfully. "Mr. Caldwell," he said quietly, "walk with us." Ethan looked surprised but obeyed immediately as the group slowly moved away from the crowded lounge entrance toward the quieter executive conference corridor overlooking the runway. The atmosphere there felt entirely different from the busy terminal. Thick carpeting softened footsteps. Glass conference walls reflected the storm outside. Soft amber lighting replaced the harsh brightness of the public concourse. Yet even in that elegant hallway, Ethan felt smaller with every step. Claire paused briefly near the giant windows overlooking a taxiing aircraft. "Do you know what the strangest part of success is?" she asked softly without turning around. No one answered immediately. "Eventually," she continued, "people stop treating you like a person and start treating you like a category." Holloway listened carefully beside her. Claire folded her arms lightly. Powerful, important, wealthy, elite. And once that happens, people either fear you or perform for you. Ethan frowned slightly as though trying to understand fully. Claire glanced back toward him. "That is why I travel like this." She gestured lightly toward her sweater and canvas bag. "It lets me see how people behave when they think nobody important is watching." Ethan lowered his eyes again. "And tonight," Claire said calmly, "I learned more about this airport in 20 minutes than any executive presentation could ever show me." Holloway exhaled heavily because he knew she was right. Endless reports and polished meetings could never expose culture the way unguarded behavior could. Marcus looked thoughtful now, absorbing every word carefully. Claire noticed him watching. "Leadership is not really tested during conferences," she said gently. "It is tested during ordinary moments. Small interactions, quiet decisions, the moments where nobody expects consequences." Ethan finally spoke again, his voice lower than before. "I think I forgot that somewhere along the way." Claire turned toward him fully now. "No," she replied softly. "I think you became too focused on control and forgot curiosity." Ethan blinked slightly. "Curiosity?" Claire nodded. "Curious people ask questions before making conclusions. Arrogant people skip directly to judgment." The hallway fell quiet again. Rain tapped softly against the enormous windows while aircraft moved slowly across the glowing runway below. Holloway rubbed his jaw thoughtfully before speaking. "You know," he admitted quietly, "this airport has spent years obsessing over appearing world-class." Claire gave a faint smile. "Most organizations confuse luxury with excellence." Holloway looked at her carefully. "And the difference?" Claire glanced toward the busy terminal beyond the glass walls where thousands of ordinary travelers continued moving through the night. "Luxury impresses people," she said softly. "Respect changes them." Nobody spoke after that, because deep down, each person standing there understood that the lesson unfolding tonight had nothing to do with business contracts anymore. It was about the kind of people they had quietly become while nobody was paying attention. By the time the group entered the executive conference lounge overlooking the runway, the storm outside had intensified. Rain streaked down the massive floor-to-ceiling windows while distant aircraft lights shimmered through the darkness like scattered stars across wet glass. The lounge itself was elegant in every possible way. Soft leather seating, warm amber lighting, polished walnut tables, quiet jazz music drifting faintly through hidden speakers. Yet despite the luxury surrounding them, nobody seemed focused on appearances anymore. Claire Whitaker placed her worn canvas bag gently beside one of the conference chairs and looked out toward the runway in silence. Richard Holloway stood nearby with several senior executives, each of them noticeably more subdued than before. Ethan Caldwell remained slightly apart from the group, unsure where he belonged now. Earlier that evening, he had walked through the terminal with absolute confidence in his authority. Now he felt painfully aware of every assumption he had made. Holloway finally broke the silence. "Ms. Whitaker," he said carefully, "I hope you understand that tonight does not reflect the values we want this airport to represent." Claire kept her eyes on the storm outside. "The difficult thing about culture," she replied softly, "is that people usually reveal it most honestly when they think nobody important is watching." One of the executives shifted uncomfortably at those words. Claire turned slowly toward the group. "I have visited airports all over the world," she continued. "Some had outdated technology. Some had operational problems. Some were overcrowded and chaotic. But travelers can forgive inconvenience surprisingly easily." Holloway listened carefully. "What people do not forget," Claire said quietly, "is humiliation." The room fell silent again. Ethan stared down at the carpet beneath his shoes, feeling the truth of those words settle heavily into his chest. Claire walked slowly toward the conference table where a series of polished presentation folders had already been prepared for the partnership meeting. She glanced at the top folder briefly before speaking again. "Do you know why Alt-Era systems became successful?" she asked calmly. One executive immediately answered, "Your logistics software changed airport traffic coordination nationwide." Claire gave a faint smile. "That is what our technology did. It is not why we succeeded." The executives exchanged brief, uncertain glances. Claire folded her hands lightly in front of her. "We succeeded because we studied stress." Holloway raised an eyebrow slightly. "Stress?" Claire nodded. "Airports place people under emotional pressure constantly. Delays, fear, exhaustion, time pressure, family emergencies, goodbyes, anxiety, and under pressure, small moments of kindness become unforgettable." The executives listened without interrupting now. Claire's voice remained calm, but every sentence carried quiet precision. "Most corporations study efficiency metrics," she continued. "We studied emotional memory. We discovered that travelers rarely remember perfect operations. They remember how people treated them during vulnerable moments." Ethan slowly closed his eyes for a brief second because he understood exactly what she meant. He had spent years managing complaints, delays, and angry passengers, yet somewhere along the way he had stopped seeing individuals and started seeing categories. Problems, interruptions, security concerns, status levels. The humanity had slowly disappeared beneath procedure. Claire noticed the guilt on his face but did not shame him for it. Instead, she sat down calmly at the conference table. "Mr. Caldwell," she said gently. Ethan looked up immediately. "Yes, ma'am." Claire studied him for a moment before asking, "What was your first job in hospitality?" Ethan hesitated slightly. "Front desk clerk at a roadside hotel outside Cleveland." Claire nodded with quiet interest. "And why did you choose hospitality work originally?" Ethan seemed surprised by the question. He thought for a moment before answering honestly. "Because I liked helping people feel comfortable." The room grew still. Holloway glanced toward Ethan with visible reflection because even he had never asked that question before. Claire gave a faint knowing smile. "Then somewhere over the years," she said softly, "you stopped protecting comfort and started protecting hierarchy instead." Ethan lowered his eyes immediately because the sentence struck with painful accuracy. Claire continued gently, not cruelly. "That happens to people sometimes when organizations become obsessed with exclusivity." Outside the windows, lightning flickered silently behind the rain clouds, while aircraft continued moving across the glowing runway below. The storm somehow made the room feel even more intimate. Holloway slowly sat down across from Claire. "You know," he admitted quietly, "we spent nearly $200 million renovating this airport over the last 5 years. Claire looked at him calmly. "And tonight one conversation nearly damaged all of it." Holloway nodded once. No defensiveness remained in him anymore. Only understanding. Claire glanced around the luxurious lounge one final time before speaking softly. Beautiful buildings impress investors, she said. But dignity is what makes people trust institutions. Nobody spoke after that, because every person in the room understood that trust, once broken publicly, could not simply be repaired with polished floors and executive titles. Nearly 2 hours later, the storm outside Westbridge International Airport had finally begun to calm. Rain still slid softly down the towering runway windows, but the violent wind had faded into a quiet, steady rhythm beneath the distant roar of departing aircraft. Inside the executive conference lounge, the atmosphere had changed completely from the tension that first filled Terminal 3 earlier that evening. The partnership meeting was over. The contracts remained unsigned for now, but not because negotiations had failed. Quite the opposite. Claire Whitaker had agreed to move forward with the modernization project under one condition. Every senior executive, department director, and passenger-facing manager at Westbridge International would spend 30 days working directly alongside frontline airport employees before the final agreement became official. Check-in desks, customer assistance stations, delayed flight support, passenger complaint resolution, no private offices, no executive exemptions. Richard Holloway had agreed immediately, and for the first time in years, many of the airport's senior leaders were beginning to understand parts of their organization they had never truly seen before. Claire stood quietly near the massive windows, watching an aircraft lift slowly into the dark sky beyond the rain clouds. Her reflection shimmered faintly against the glass beside the blinking runway lights. Behind her, the executives gathered their folders in thoughtful silence. Nobody seemed eager to return to business as usual anymore. Ethan Caldwell remained near the doorway, unsure whether he should leave or stay. The confidence that once defined him earlier that evening had disappeared completely, replaced by something quieter and far more honest. Self-awareness. Claire sensed him, lingering, and turned toward him gently. "Mr. Caldwell." Ethan straightened immediately. "Yes, ma'am." Claire gave a faint smile. "You do not need to call me ma'am every sentence." Ethan looked embarrassed for the first time all evening. A few executives nearby smiled awkwardly at the comment, grateful for the small release in tension. Claire stepped away from the window slowly. "I meant what I said earlier," she continued calmly. "I do not believe people should be permanently defined by their worst moment." Ethan swallowed hard before answering. "I appreciate that more than you know." Claire studied him carefully. "But growth only matters if people are willing to confront uncomfortable truths honestly." Ethan nodded immediately. "I understand." And this time he truly did. Because standing there beneath the soft amber lights of the executive lounge, Ethan realized something painful about himself. He had spent years chasing professionalism so aggressively that he had slowly lost empathy along the way. Appearance became shorthand. Status became identity. Efficiency replaced humanity. Somewhere between policies, executive travelers, and VIP protocols, he had forgotten why hospitality existed in the first place. Claire seemed to recognize the realization settling across his face. "You know," she said softly, "the people who changed my life most were rarely powerful." Ethan listened carefully. "A public school teacher who stayed after class because she noticed I loved engineering books. A waitress who brought my mother free coffee when she worked double shifts. A gate agent who once sat beside a terrified passenger during severe turbulence just to keep him calm." Claire smiled faintly at the memories. None of those people were wealthy, but all of them understood dignity. The room fell quiet once more. Holloway slowly removed his glasses, visibly reflective now. Even the executives standing nearby seemed emotionally affected in ways no corporate seminar could ever accomplish. Claire glanced again toward the busy terminal beyond the conference hallway, where thousands of ordinary travelers continued moving through the airport night. Families, workers, students, elderly couples, exhausted parents, people carrying invisible burdens no employee could ever fully understand. "Most people are fighting battles we cannot see," she said softly. "That is why respect should never depend on appearance." Ethan lowered his head slightly. "I think I forgot that." Claire walked toward the conference room exit, lifting her worn canvas bag onto her shoulder once more. The same bag that had triggered so much judgment